A great Tamil poet from the 5th or 6th century AD wrote, "Wisdom is to live in tune with the changing world." I learnt this great quote that really perhaps helps us all trying to live in a changing multipolar world. From reading Dr S Jaishankar's The Indian Way. Dr S Jaishankar is the Indian External Affairs Minister, and his book, his actions as Foreign Minister, and the Indian cultural heritage of statecraft is perhaps a lesson to all the leaders of the Western world, to all the leaders of the world, to find a way to live well together in this changing multipolar world. Let's have a look at how. I am Jeff Rich. Welcome to the Burning Archive. You can check out more about me and the channel on the channel trailer on YouTube. Dr. S Jaishankar has done really quite a remarkable thing for a political leader or even a bureaucratic leader. He has written a wise, insightful, intelligent and highly readable book. It's called The Indian Way, and it is a window onto how India is acting on its new soft power in the world, its new diplomacy in the world, and its new status as one of the leaders of the world, one of the great states of the world. Many of us around the world are looking to India to guide us on a better path of dialogue and diplomacy through this conflict-ridden multipolar world. And Dr. S Jaishankar's The Indian Way is a wonderful way to gain some insight into that and to see the world, the multipolar world, through very different eyes. Dr. S Jaishankar is the Indian External Affairs Minister. He has been since 2019. But before then, he was the head of the Foreign Affairs Department, the Secretary of the Foreign Affairs Department in India, and a very unusual thing amongst foreign ministers around the world, a genuine career diplomat, joining the Indian Foreign Service in the 1970s and having postings in Moscow, in Washington, in Tokyo, in Beijing, and also in Europe. An extraordinary, deep and profound experience that he has brought into his role as now India's foreign minister, as India pursues a much stronger foreign policy and as India starts to assume a more influential role in the world. In 2020, he wrote this book, The Indian Way, a guide to India's new role in the world. And he wrote it primarily for an Indian audience and not like the intellectual elite or the diplomatic elite or the political elite. He wrote it for, the ordinary citizen of India so that they could appreciate the changing role of India in the world and so that they could also appreciate and live in tune with the changing multipolar world that he saw around him. And there's a fascinating extended conversation with Dr. Jaishankar on a podcast from the Indian Express where he talks about how he went about writing his book. And he says quite clearly that he, and then he was either the head of the Foreign Affairs Department or close to the head of the Foreign Affairs Department in India during the 2010s. He experienced, like everyone around the world, a series of shocks that shook people's understanding of what the world was meant to be like. And he admits quite openly that he was as perplexed as everyone about what it all meant. There was the events in Ukraine in 2014 leading to Russia occupying Crimea. There was Donald Trump's election in 2016. There was the Brexit referendum in 2016. There was the Syria conflict, the massive migration crisis in Europe as a result, and a series of big events around the world, of which perhaps the most deep and profound was both India's growing wealth and population, as well as, of course, the rise of China, and perhaps through the 2010s, under the new leadership of Xi Jinping, a perhaps more assertive role for China in the world. And in the conversation, Dr. Jaishankar says, I was perplexed. And if, here am I, the head of the Foreign Affairs Department, and I don't understand what's going on. How is the ordinary citizen to cope? And what he also observed, I guess, amongst a lot of the political, media, intellectual classes around the world was a rage against the events that were happening. Brexit was terrible. Donald Trump was terrible. Vladimir Putin was terrible. Xi Jinping was terrible. The world was entering another period of 1930s, and there was all these new Hitlers emerging around the world. But what Jaishankar also says is fundamentally this kind of response doesn't really come to terms with actually understanding what was changing in the multipolar world during these years. There were the shocks, but people responded to these shocks with outrage, perhaps, not with insight, not with curiosity, not with wisdom. And I can relate to Dr. Jaishankar's point because I remember experiencing the same puzzlement, that this was not the world that I'd understood it to be. The world was revealing itself as something different to the stories I had grown accustomed to telling myself about the world. And I certainly found that led me to explore what the hell was going on rather than just rage against the machine. It was an attempt to try to understand what was going on. And I suspect part of the growth in all the channels and all the independent on YouTube, all the channels about geopolitics and world affairs on YouTube, and so much of the independent media is partly that same response amongst you, amongst people around the world saying, something's clearly going on in the world. How can we learn to understand it when our leaders, our media are telling us fairy tales about it? What we want to do is actually understand it, and so we can live in tune with this changing world. For me, all those shocks were a little bit like Dr. Jaishankar's own experience. It led him to try to understand the world, and then, given his role as the head of the Foreign Affairs Department, to try to explain it to political leaders, to try to explain it to the public, and to try to set a intelligent diplomatic strategy for India in this newly complicated multipolar world. And he sets out brilliantly that that thinking in the Indian way, and I've even heard some Indian commentators talk about the approach there as the Jaishankar doctrine, as a kind of fundamental idea about Indian foreign policy that has set a new direction. Just as there have been doctrines in American foreign policy and doctrines in Russian foreign policy, who knows, maybe there have been doctrines in Australian foreign policy. I think generally it's just do what the United States says. But so Jaishankar's book sets out a kind of a doctrine and a vision for India's new role in the world. I think everyone across the world, whether you're viewing this video from India or from America or from Europe or from Australia or from Asia, Africa or the Americas, I think we can all learn a lot from Dr. Jaishankar's thought and his actions as a diplomat, especially over the last couple of years through the COVID crisis and through the Ukraine crisis. And the fundamental insight, I think, from that book is, as he says, and I'll just read this quote, "We have been conditioned to think of the post-1945 world as the norm, but the natural state of the world is multipolarity." Jaishankar sees the world as multipolar, complicated, with many sides and many competing objectives, contradictions, and different realities. And to some degree, he draws very much on the deep, long traditions of Indian thought, Indian culture, and Indian statecraft to navigate his way through this complicated multipolar world. In the conversation on the Indian Express podcast, he talks about how, in trying to make sense of it, he turned to that heritage and to the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And apologies to Indian Hindi and other speakers if I haven't quite pronounced Mahabharata well. To truly act well and with wisdom in the multipolar world, we need to kind of drop the dualistic mindset that is so dominant in the West, that defines global conflicts as democracy versus autocracy, that sees every looming conflict as the next World War III, that will draw the whole world into being forced to take sides, that sees things as good and evil. Instead, we need to draw on the deep traditions of other cultures, including the great Mahabharata and all its wisdom of how statecraft can be, as Dr. S Jaishankar says. And I'll just give you a quick overview of the main ideas in each chapter of Dr. S Jaishankar's book, and I'm just going to pop into another room so I can do that with some of the key things on screen. So here I am down in the study, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of Dr. S Jaishankar's The India Way. And I'm just going to do that against the background of the Indian flag as a celebration of the India Way. I'm not expressing any nationalist sentiments. Okay, so I'll try to keep this fairly brief. And the India Way is really divided into 8 chapters with a brief postscript on the world after the virus. And each one of those chapters really addresses a key theme. So the lessons of Arwad is about the dangers of Indian strategic complacency. And as Dr. Jaishankar says there, will the world continue to define India, or will India now define itself? Arwad remains the symbol of the former to this day. Arwad was a province of India where Nawabs ruled, and the British conquered in 1856, leading into the Indian Wars of the First Indian War of Independence in 1857. So it's a profound symbol of, I guess, allowing other states to divide and rule India. And this chapter really addresses, I guess, an Indian tradition of self-absorption over defensiveness, and I guess challenges India to take up its new place in the world. Chapter 2 is the art of the disruption, and this chapter is all about America and the United States, and the title, of course, is a reference to Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal, and it's really coming to terms with the United States coming to terms with its new role after Donald Trump. It might be interesting to hear Dr. Jaishankar's thoughts about how much of that is or is not true under Joe Biden. And he makes a wonderful comment here in a set of extremely sharp observations about American politics and what led to Donald Trump's election. That when the deep state joins the loud state, by which I assume he means the media in the US, a structural shift is underway. And beyond America, this is also a reflection on how globalization has led to profound insecurities across America, but also the West, and to some degree a reaction to the opportunities that has created Asian powers. Chapter 3 is Christian's Choice on a fairly hot day here in Melbourne, Australia, and this is the chapter where Dr. Jaishankar talks about the Mahabharata and how it informs Indian strategic thought. And he says that a multipolar world with frenemies, balance of power, and a clash of values may today present a challenge for global politics, yet these were the very characteristics of the period in India that the Mahabharata wrote about. And it is a fascinating account, and of course it refers to the crucial moment in the Mahabharata where Krishna sings the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, and Arjuna, who is reluctant to take up arms and see the deaths of so many, still does so. And it is very much a rallying call, I guess, for India to make the strategic, competitive, sharp-witted choices it needs in the new world. Chapter 4 is Dogmas of Delhi, and I've had a little fail on my quote there, but so what he says in this chapter is the world has changed, and much more broadly than trumped, and that India cannot rely on the old orthodoxies of its bureaucratic and intellectual liberal elite. That in a way, the ordinary people of India, the street of India, has had much better instincts for the new changes of the multipolar world than its leading bureaucrats and officials and intellectuals, many of whom, of course, live overseas. Chapter 5 is of mandarins and masses, and in a way he also talks about the elite popular division across the world, particularly in the West, but also in India. And again, it's a fascinating discussion of the new, social forces, particularly with technology and connectivity and culture, that is driving new combinations of global and national identities, and one that cannot be constrained within an elite vision. Mandarins can no longer be impervious to the masses. In chapter 6, the Nimzio, or I believe it might be said Nimzu, Indian defence, he draws an analogy between a particular kind of chess move that was developed in the early 20th century, I think, where black, the usually defensive side, seizes the initiative. And in a way, this is also the chapter where he most actively discusses the rise of China. And I guess he's also saying that there's been a lot of lags in India's response to the world events and to its relationship with China. China's early engagement with the United States in the 1970s, its economic reforms, its exercise of nuclear options, all of which India was perhaps a little bit more slow to get onto the train with. And he is very much advocating a different kind of engagement, but also one that emphasises that China and India have had profound cultural, strategic, political, military connections and economic connections for thousands of years. China and India are two civilizational polities whose near parallel journey to become modern states has not been without friction. And this is a particularly valuable chapter for anyone from the West to read, particularly anyone in the West concerned with China, because it will change your perspective of China's place in the world. You'll realise how central the India-China relationship, or multifaceted relationship, really is. It's not all about two sides. It's not all about us and them. It's not all about the United States. Then in chapter 7, A Delayed Destiny, he really discusses Japan and more broadly Southeast Asia, but especially Japan, which has had some, Dr Jaishankar's book is a fascinating insight to retelling the stories of the 20th century war and diplomacy from a broader perspective than just the narrow confines of the Western media. And he really brings out the crucial role of Japan and the potential opportunities for Japan. But he also emphasizes its multilateral nature. Earlier in the book, I think he says, something along the lines of the challenge for India is to engage with America, to manage China, to reassure Russia, to awaken Japan or connect with Japan, to expand its neighborhood, to increase its influence. It's a genuinely multipolar, multilateral vision, so different to so many of the tunnel vision views of European, American, and sadly Australian leaders, diplomatic leaders. So here Jaishankar says Asia is being shaped largely by the outlook of the US, the power of China, the weight of Russia, the collectivism of ASEAN, the volatility of the Middle East, and the rise of India. If there is an underplayed element, that is in the presence of Japan. Perhaps also very much reflecting Shinzo Abe's influence on Asian diplomacy for the period in which he was leader and alive. Chapter 8 is the Pacific Indian, and this is an absolutely brilliant set of insights into that very muddy concept, the Indo-Pacific, and Dr. Jaishankar shows genuine understanding of the history and the murkiness and the origins and the range of uses of that concept. And he compares the Indo-Pacific to, I guess, Central Asia, Afghanistan region in the 19th century, describing it as the contemporary version of the great game where multiple players with diverse ambitions display their strategic skill, and notes, perhaps with a very firm tongue in his cheek, that the British Empire operated its own version of the Indo-Pacific that was neither free nor open. And of course, the alleged aim of American and Australian, and I guess British foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, that strange new definition of the Asia-Pacific, is to be, keep it Indo-Pacific free and open. Then finally, in the postscript, he addresses the world after the virus, noting that our world was and this is a great summary, I guess, of the overall trends of change, the changes in the multipolar world that he observes in the book. Our world was moving discernibly towards an era of greater disruption, stronger nationalism, sharper competitiveness, and a questioning of rules and regimes. And along came a virus. So that is Dr. Jaishankar's book. I will pop back into my other camera angle now, and we'll discuss not just Dr. Jaishankar's book, but his actions and his words as a diplomat, which have really made him probably the most significant Indian foreign minister for a very long time, and arguably the most significant, influential and capable foreign minister on the world stage today. Every strategist has their blind spots, of course, and surely Dr. S Jaishankar has his. Surely the collective intelligence of the Indian government has theirs. But they are producing wiser, more complicated, more sophisticated, and more prudent statecraft than the Western powers at the moment. So I really do think the world should look to Dr. Jaishankar for that wisdom. And of course, what is good for India may not be good for your country or my country. But I think we should adopt the same approach of India, of finding a good balance between global and national interests, and having this complicated set of relationships where we have no permanent values-based ideological allies. We find a way to work with everybody to de-escalate conflicts everywhere and to find fields of cooperation with as many as we reasonably can. And as well as articulating in his book such an excellent strategy for diplomacy in a multipolar world, Dr. Jaishankar is also doing it in his actions. So let's have a quick little whistle-stop tour of some of those examples of how he is doing it. He is appearing widely in the Western media as well as in the Indian media, and many of these appearances are kind of get a lot of publicity in the Indian media because there's a sense of pride in the Indian foreign minister asserting an Indian point of view in the world. Not so much in the Western media, so I think it's probably good to share some of these things, including not so much even in the sort of independent alternative media that is on YouTube, on on geopolitics, which still tends to focus a lot on, America, Europe, and its conflicts with China. Let me just give you some brief glimpses of Dr. Jaishankar in action and how he is not just talking about the Indian way, but acting on the Indian way. So first of all, his position on Ukraine, or India's position on Ukraine, and there's been enormous pressure on India to side with the West on Ukraine. No real pressure, as far as I know, from Russia for India to side with them. And India has consistently sort of abstained from votes criticising Russia at the United Nations. And here is Dr. Jaishankar responding to one of his many critics on India's many flummoxed critics who seem to think that India should not even dare contemplate having a different position to the West on the conflict in Ukraine.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. As you are well aware, the whole world noticed that India, as a very influential country, has never publicly condemned Russia's assault and invasion into a neighboring country. Why is that so? Can you really be neutral in a war for which obviously one side bears all responsibility?
Well, look, I think in international relations, you have sometimes very complicated situations. And where we are concerned, we have always taken the position that the way out is for the countries concerned to get back to dialogue and to diplomacy.
I'll come to that soon, but is this a complicated situation? Is this really complicated? There's just one big country invading its neighbor.
No, look, I can give you many instances of countries who have violated the sovereignty of another country. If I were to ask where Europe stood on a lot of those, I'm afraid I'll get a long silence. So do understand one thing. At the end of the day, we make judgments in foreign policy based on what we think are our long-term interests and what is good for the world.
But you and Prime Minister Modi have already said that, regularly call on both sides to stop the war and to negotiate. However, can one really urge Ukraine to stop defending itself? After all, there are no Ukrainian tanks in Russia. There are Russian tanks and planes and missiles destroying Ukraine.
I think that's a bit of a misrepresentation. I think what we do is to say, get back to dialogue and diplomacy. There was dialogue and diplomacy in the early days of the conflict. So it's not that it didn't happen. So it's not for us to put conditions and to say this country is equal to that country. That's your judgment.
And while all this conflict in Ukraine is happening, there have also been some serious, border disputes between India and China, which are very long-standing. And one of the fascinating insights from Dr. Jaishankar's book is how long and complex the history of diplomatic geostrategic relationships between India and China is. And we, again, in the West tend to view the rise of China as a sort of dualistic thing of US versus China, whereas in reality, what Dr. Jaishankar says is forging a close relationship between India and China, a productive relationship and a peaceful relationship between India and China is fundamental to the success of the Asian century and of the rise of the various BRICS nations and of a rebalancing of the world order. But it's been done in the sense of real and complicated relationships, in which he has also played a very critical role, not just talking big ideas, but actually delivering tangible improvements that de-escalate and disengage China and India from military actions in the border disputes between them.
Always be two axes at this point. I think it's an understood, accepted fact that you have the West, US led, you have China as the next potential axis. Where does India fit into this picture? Are you planning to not pick a side?
No, I'm sorry. That is exactly where I disagree with you. This is the construct you are trying to impose on me, and I don't accept it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to join this axis or not, and if I'm not joining this, I must be with the other one. I don't accept that. I mean, I think I'm 1/5 of the world's population. I am today the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. I mean, forget the history, civilization bit. Everybody knows that. But I think I'm entitled to have my own side.
And towards the end of last year, Dr. Jaishankar also chaired a United Nations Security Council meeting that debated and discussed the new, what the world wanted in terms of a new multilateral world order, whether they believed in the Western liberal rules-based international order or whether they wanted something different, more multilateral, more multipolar, in which there was a broader ownership from many countries, many nations in the world politics of the world. And here's a brief section from that meeting with Dr. Jaishankar talking.
Excellencies, we have convened here today for an honest conversation about the effectiveness of multilateral institutions created more than 75 years ago. The question before us is how best they can be reformed, particularly as the need to reform is less deniable with each passing year. This debate and its outcome will not only help determine what kind of United Nations we wish to see, but also what kind of global order that best reflects contemporary realities. The need for a new orientation for a reformed multilateral system, or norms, as we titled it, flows from this widespread recognition. While the matter concerns the fullest constituency of member states, the Security Council too has an important stake in the consideration of this crucial question, because at the end of the day, it has direct implications for maintaining international peace and security. And it is in the fitness of things that such a discussion takes place as an open debate. All of us are aware that the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council has been on the UNGA agenda for well over 3 decades. While the debate on reforms has meandered aimlessly, the real world, meanwhile, has changed dramatically. We see that in terms of economic prosperity, technology capabilities, political influence, and developmental progress. The broad dispersal of capabilities and responsibilities has been expressed, for example, in the emergence of the G20. That realization is now steadily percolating through the wider membership of the UN. At the 77th UNGA, we were all witness to a growing sentiment in favor of reform. Our challenge is to translate that into concrete outcomes.
Dr Jaishankar, of course, has not only delivered this kind of message in formal diplomatic channels, he has also taken the message to journalists, and in the conversation with the Indian Express, he says how he's a relatively combative person. He's very happy to fight back against misrepresentations in the media, and some of his challenges to Western journalists have really been enormously have gone viral, I guess, in India, and they are totally worth watching. So here is one recent one where he intelligently, diplomatically, and firmly, totally takes apart a Western journalist's question with a whole lot of funny intellectual baggage behind it about India's role in the world.
Number one, why I wanted to interrupt you in a way. I mean, I'm partly reacting to the previous observation. Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That if it is you, it's yours. If it is me, it's ours. I think that's something, and I see, reflections of that. Again, in terms of, there is a linkage today which is being made. A linkage between China and India and what's happening in Ukraine. So come on, guys. I mean, China and India happened way before anything happened in Ukraine. So the Chinese don't need a precedent somewhere else in the world on how to, engage us or not engage us, or be difficult with us or not be difficult with us. So as I said, I mean, I just see this as frankly a not very clever argument, a very self-serving one. This idea that, your grand strategy must be about how you will choose. I will do what, as all of us do. I will weigh the situation, everybody, after all, how do countries eventually make decisions?
And then finally, he has also challenged some of the lingering, let's call them imperial assumptions of many Western, European and American leaders, whether India should be taking a strong and assertive role in the world. Notoriously, the European foreign affairs minister, that's not the exact title, Joseph Borrell, said that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. And Dr Jaishankar has really challenged some of these lingering attitudes, the patronizing, fundamentally probably racist, anti-Hindu, anti-Indian sentiments from the imperial powers, Britain and America, which also shared some complicity, their attitudes towards India. And he's also been quite open and challenging about India's 2 centuries of humiliation and the looting and the pillaging of India by the Western powers, and indeed also America's ongoing desire to restrict India and its support for Pakistan, in Dr Jaishankar's view, especially supporting terrorist action.
If you look at the last 9 years, there's no doubt, that the government, the politics of the day is more nationalist. And I don't think, I'm proud of it. I don't think there is anything to be apologetic about. But the same nationalist people, they have done more projects abroad, they have helped more countries abroad, they have done, greater support, they have moved forward in disaster situations in other countries. So, if you read next time in a foreign newspaper, because they always, foreign newspaper, they like using words like Hindu nationalist government. Okay, they will not say, in America, Europe, they will not say Christian nationalist or whatever. These adjectives are very specially reserved for us. Okay, so next time you read it, ask yourself, how wrongly are they reading me? That they actually do not understand that this country is getting ready to do more with the world, not less with the world.
India's diplomacy, its soft power, its cultural rebalancing, explicitly also what Dr Jaishankar said he was doing in articulating the Indian cultural heritage of statecraft in the Mahabharata in his book on how we can all cope with a multipolar world. India's diplomacy, its soft power, its new cultural rebalancing, they need more attention from global leaders, but also the global community with an interest in geopolitics that we find on YouTube. You probably won't find much of these insights about Indian statecraft, Indian diplomacy, Dr Jaishankar, or the great Indian cultural heritage of statecraft on your mainstream media news. You might see BBC documentaries accusing Narendra Modi of things 20 or 30 years ago. And even I think on many of the geopolitics channels that you do find on YouTube, I think there is a bit of a gap there in talking about India as integrated and central to the refashioning of the multipolar world. It's not all about the United States. It's not all about China. It's not all about Russia and Europe. India is now the world's largest nation. It is the world's largest democracy, and it is perhaps also showing us a path for more sophisticated diplomacy in a multipolar world. It's a path Australia could do well to follow. Not that Australia should adopt the exact policies of India, because we have our own interest, we have our own place in the world. But it's perhaps time that we stop being a loyal sub-imperial power of America and before that Britain, and find our way amongst the great wars of the world, the great Mahabharata of the world, and learn to be grown-up diplomats in the multipolar world. If you like this video, do like and subscribe, tell someone else about it, and I'll see you in the next video.